Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of The Extra Shift. Special edition again. No Brendan today, but I am joined by Leah Merrall, of course, from PHNX Sports. How are we going?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fantastic. It's great to get to chat again, especially post coming to Australia.
Yes, I know. Very different circumstances than last time. So I have a newfound perspective.
Newfound perspective on what the hell's going on down here. So it's obviously great. And obviously the other benefit of this time is we get to talk about hockey. Because like last time it was about arenas. We're not talking arenas.
I don't want to talk about arenas, please.
I refused when I spoke to people in the Australian NHL fans page and said to them, we're going to talk to Leah again. My thing was, we're not talking arena. I'd like to talk about the on-ice product for a change.
Yes, me too.
Well, especially since it's going relatively well.
Yeah.
So the Coyotes have actually been playing some really good hockey. We'll get into that in a lot more depth. But I do want to start from an Australian perspective with the Global Series. So, you got to come down to Australia and experience Australian food, coffee, culture, hockey vaguely. What was that like in general?
It was really cool. So it was actually my second time in Australia. The first time I went in 2019 and I just traveled for 3 weeks all over the East. So this was my first time coming back for something very focused, such as a hockey trip. And I have to admit, in 2019, there was no part of me that was on the lookout for anything hockey in Australia because I didn't.
You would have been looking hard.
Yeah, I didn't think it existed, frankly. But it was very cool to see not only the hockey infrastructure that already existed in Melbourne with the O'Brien Ice House and, what they were able to turn into Rod Laver Arena was really cool. But just to see the number of hockey fans that were in Australia, like we met so many Australians who love hockey and loved random teams. I met Coyotes fans and I said, why the Coyotes? And a lot of people said the jerseys or they just watched the games. And it was just, all of that was really cool. And I was surprised by the level of, even, talking to you before and discovering that you're a San Jose Sharks fan and why, it's just interesting. I didn't realize the reach that the NHL already had prior to the Global Series and just the infrastructure that already existed there.
It's something I don't think the NHL realizes, to be honest, as much as you can point at them and go, hey guys, it's here. They kind of don't. So it was a bit of a surprise to everyone when, they went, we're coming to Melbourne for the Global Series game. It's like, oh, okay. Cool. Not because they don't usually pay us much attention unless Nathan Walker does something. And then they go, oh, there's an Australian. Hey, everybody, look.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's the only time we've ever really mattered. So, but it was an interesting idea of bringing out, and there are a lot of people who I think were a bit, oh, why are they sending the Kings and the Coyotes to Australia? I mean, that's, why? And there were a lot of people early on who were like, oh, we want, Boston or this team and this team. What we found actually within the Australian NHL fans pages, we've had a massive influx of people after the game, and a lot of them, because we ask everyone when they join, who's your team? A lot of Coyotes. So, I think from an Arizona perspective, the trip was a massive success just in terms of, eyes on the product and people going, I like them.
Yeah, for sure. And first of all, as someone who took that trip, an East Coast team, that would not have been a fun trip because I landed back in LA after the 13-hour flight. All I had left was a 45-minute flight. But there were people who were flying with us who lived on the East Coast, lived in New York or Boston or Montreal, and they still had another 4 and 5 hour flight to go. And I thought, there's no way an East Coast team could have done this trip. Just to make it back to LA or Arizona, that was the right choice. But yeah, you're as far as the Coyotes kind of taking advantage of this opportunity. Even I had the same thing. I was like, why Arizona? When I think of Arizona playing in an international game, I think of maybe one day in Mexico City or somewhere, in South America. But you're so right. And another thing that I found being at the Global Series in Melbourne, the sense that Australians kind of love an underdog story, and I feel like the Coyotes are the ultimate underdog story, and they're kind of easy to cheer for, let alone, Logan Cooley, which I'm sure we'll talk a lot about. The jerseys are some of the best in the National Hockey League and in hockey in general, in my opinion. There's a lot of reasons to become a Coyotes fan right now and get on the wagon.
Oh, one of the biggest sets of before this, one of the biggest lots of engagement we've had in the group was when the Coyotes went back to the logo, the logo, and it was like, oh, they're bringing those jerseys back. they're some awesome jerseys. And yeah, so again, that's one of the things I think that draws people in. We'll talk a little bit about the general trip, and then we'll come, of course, to Logan Cooley. We will definitely get to some Logan Cooley conversation. Yep. One of the conversation points early on, one of the only slight negative that was reported early on was like the ice at Rod Laver Arena was interesting. I think it was the Coyotes practice was the one that got cancelled.
It was, yeah, that was a huge bummer.
And that's interesting for me because like O'Brien Icehouse is actually quite a decent facility, especially given where it is in the world. And then you go over to Rod Laver Arena and it's pooling and puddling. What feedback did you get or hear from other people about like what Rod Laver was like to play at?
Well, I think the ice that Friday that they ended up having to cancel the Coyotes practice, I think that was extremely concerning.
We were worried.
Yeah, like LA, they had the first practice, so they kind of got the ice when it was fresh. I don't really know what their takeaway was, but the Coyotes players were only on the ice for a few minutes before coming off. I think all they did was like skate a few laps, take a group photo, and come off. And I was thinking, like we played the first games in 24 hours here. What's going to happen? And, you can see the puddles, you can see the pooling, and it was stressful because everything was hinging on the ice being good. And the last thing you want to do, especially in a preseason game, is put an NHL player in a situation to become hurt or injured. And that was my biggest concern. So it was a bummer that the fans in attendance and even for us and the team missed out on the open practice there. But I think they got it together in the 24 hours between that moment and the first game. And I think the ice ended up being good. I mean, it's not like the best ice anyone's ever skated on, but all temporary. I mean, the NHL has done this so many times. They have the Heritage Classic, the Winter Classic, like they do temporary ice all over. And it's not like it was hot in Melbourne at all. In fact, it was like pretty chilly.
You got a very temperate time.
Yeah, exactly. So I didn't hear anything bad once it was resolved.
So yeah, it was and look, it was an interesting trip as well because you get the exposure to things like you get a lot of Australian culture. You said you'd done a bit of traveling. Now I did put it in the group and ask for some questions as well, and really interesting. There were a couple of really good hockey questions, but the main threads were things like, so the first question that's going to come up, which is simple, which was thoughts on Australian coffee.
Oh my goodness. Well, I wish Craig was here because Craig Morgan, he is my co-host. He's he's notorious for being like having high taste, and I'm notorious for drinking my Folgers coffee and not caring. Like he grinds his coffee beans every morning, and like I don't really have a high standard for coffee. When I went to Australia 4 years ago, I had a different coffee taste at the time. I did not like the Australian coffee. It was too strong for me. This time I definitely could appreciate it. It like you can tell it's really good coffee. Craig was beside himself. He was having like 3 coffees a day. I was 2 in the beginning, then 1 a day toward the end, because truthfully by the end I kind of just missed like my drip normal brew. Like I didn't want milk. I didn't want foam. Like I just wanted my like mug with my black drip coffee in it by the end, which I'm sorry if that offends everybody, but that's how I felt. But I definitely could taste how good the coffee was. So
we'll have to make sure that Craig gets some coffee.
Yes.
Also, the other one was any funny or confusing sayings that you heard while you were here.
I don't know if I heard any then. Like when I went 4 years ago, I heard so many that I made a list on my phone because I was like, this is so bizarre. Like Arvo and we're gonna sit down for tea, but tea meant dinner. Like that was
dinner.
But that was on my last trip. There wasn't really much on this trip, but I do remember
the fact that nobody in Australia refers to McDonald's as McDonald's. It's Macca's. Like they even changed it in their ad campaigns, and some of the McDonald's even have Macca's written under the ad.
That's so funny.
That level. But yeah, things like Arvo. Tea's one that I get all the time. I do another podcast which does a lot of Canadian stuff, and whenever we mention things like tea and those sorts of, they go, what? And occasionally I'll get messages through. We'll say something like they were going flat out, and I get, what's flat out? It's like flat out, and it's not like flat out just as fast. It actually means flat out like a lizard drinking is a full sentence. And everyone goes, what? It's like, you've never watched a lizard drink when it's really thirsty. That's the sort of insanity. So, I understand that. Now, from an on-ice perspective, it probably helped for the Coyotes having Logan Cooley score that goal. So, obviously, that was probably the major talking point out of the whole series. Do you think it was sort of a good thing, obviously, for not only the Coyotes, but for him as well in that first game to have that sort of moment?
Yeah, for sure. Like, I went into that game not really knowing what to expect. It was the first preseason game of the NHL calendar in general, let alone the first game the Coyotes had played. So I really had no expectations. I actually expected a pretty sloppy, boring game, and we got the opposite of that. Yeah. And honestly, like, that was one of the most fun hockey games I've been to in recent memory. That goal, obviously, it was like you couldn't have written something better. The young rookie coming in, they're all eyes are on him. He changes his mind midway through the summer to go to the Coyotes rather than return to his sophomore year at Minnesota. And then he does that in his first NHL, even though it's not a regular season game, but it's his first NHL game. He does that, and you're thinking, oh my God, like, this is the future. This is unbelievable. And it was a highlight reel goal. I mean, social media just absolutely lit up. And since it was the first preseason game, the only game played that night, kind of like all eyes were on it anyway, even back in North America. So it couldn't have gone any better for Cooley and the Coyotes in that first game.
Because it was really interesting from like a lot of the Australian perspective, because I think the Coyotes had a split roster going on at the time. Most of the roster was here, but there were some of the development prospects were playing in games over there. And there were people who were sort of tangentially following it, who saw that, had they sent the full roster, and then they watched the game and went, yeah, no, they have. This is the team. The others are the prospects playing their thing over in North America again. But it was a fascinating thing to watch. The Kings sort of came. I thought the Kings. It was interesting as well. You mentioned about not wanting injuries, because the Kings, I think, in that second game, like Kopitar didn't take the ice, and they rested a bunch of people in the second game. Largely, I think, injury concerns. But that first game in particular felt a little bit like a track meet at times. Teams that they were just like, let's just up and down the ice nonstop. And then for him to stand out by doing that, as I said, I think that's what you want, especially as you mentioned, the underdog thing. And Australians tend to like that underdog and like someone who does something like that and like steps out. And he did that. I think a lot of people just went, I'm going to look at the Coyotes this year. That's really fun.
Yeah.
And he sort of continued it on. I mean, he's currently statistically the leading rookie in the league.
Yeah, tied for
that
it.
kind of guard. So, yeah, statistically, he's the top scoring rookie in the league at the moment. So that's something that's promising. I mean, how have you seen that sort of translate into that preseason form translate into his regular season form so far?
I think, it's funny because you look at the rookie point leaders and it's a 4-way tie right now. Logan Cooley is one of the 4. But it's hard because he hasn't had the goal scoring success that we saw in the preseason. I think you saw that crazy goal in Australia. You saw him score on a breakaway in the preseason. Elsewhere, he had a penalty shot, shootout goals. Like, he was scoring left and right in the preseason. I think he actually led the team either in points or goals in the preseason. So then the regular season starts and he gets a point in his first NHL game. So you're thinking, all right, here we go. And then he kept getting an assist and an assist and an assist. And I think a lot of the Coyotes fans here were thinking, all right, like, Bedard's out there over there scoring goals already. Like, yes, Cooley's getting points, but why hasn't he scored? And I think I was surprised it took him so long to score. And I think I was also surprised he still hasn't scored since that first goal. So despite, being among the rookie point leaders, I would like to see him score more, especially because we saw it in the preseason. But I think there's a lot of factors at play there. And by no means am I like, he's not living up to expectation. Like, he's 19 playing in his 13th NHL game ever tonight, So, like, we can hit the brakes on the panic, but I just think some people were maybe expecting to see him score a little more.
I mean, it's been a really interesting start for the Coyotes. They've had a fairly good start. They're sitting, right in the middle of that Central. And it's an interesting time to be sitting in the middle of the Central with how that sort of is very topsy-turvy. Looking at the Central itself, like, again, apart from the Avs and the Stars, and when we did our preseason projections, we sort of said, apart from the Avs and the Stars, I don't really trust anybody else in that division to be decent. And you can't really, like, the Jets at the moment are sitting just above the Coyotes, but they've got a history of like fighting amongst themselves and falling apart. And, all these rumors about, kind of Hellebuck, will he stay, even though the re-signing, what happens there, even though he's re-signed his contract, you can't necessarily suggest that it's going to last. The Wild, the cap strung all over the place. The Blues are still basking in a cup from a couple of years ago. And the Preds are rebuilding, and the Blackhawks are a Connor Bedard team and nothing else. So I think it's kind of a good time for the Coyotes to start finding this tempo and form that they're finding, and getting scoring from a wide array of places, which I think is also really promising.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the Central Division. It's crazy because 2 years ago, the Central Division arguably was the strongest division in the NHL. And now they might be the weakest division in the NHL, which is insane. And, before the season, even Bill Armstrong said, like, we're not a playoff team. We're not. And like, we all summer were like, well, this isn't a playoff team yet. But now you look and you're like, hold on a second. Like, the Coyotes right now are in the second wild card spot behind Anaheim, just as we all expected.
Exactly.
But I mean, even so, the Coyotes are just 1 point away from being right there in the top three of the division, and just like, it's so tight in the Central. And if they have an outside shot at making the playoffs, like at this point, for me, it's don't say no, because of what's going on around them. But as you mentioned, they definitely have more scoring depth this year that we didn't see last year. Unfortunately, Jason Zucker's been out with injury for a few games, which I feel like has affected them. But when you look at that night that they beat the Blackhawks 8-1, every forward had a point except for Hayton, Keller, and Schmaltz, which is hilarious, the top line. But even though that was kind of like, oh, is that bad? You get to look down the line and say, actually, like, it's really great that there's this much depth of scoring down the lineup, which is something that, Coyotes fans aren't really accustomed to or haven't been for years.
Yeah, it's been really good to watch that. And again, this year is kind of a little bit of found money, as Bill Armstrong said, not looking at being a playoff team. It's a bit of found money, remembering that nobody on your defense is under contract at the end of this year. Like, they're all off contract at the end of this year. So to sort of what this roster is sort of looking at the start, it gives there's a lot of scope for development. There's a lot of scope for building on this. And if they happen to make the playoffs with this team going forward, or get at least close enough that they're sniffing that, it could be really interesting, especially since they've still got something that not a lot of teams in this league have: cap space. And a bunch of second and third round picks, like more second and third round picks than anybody in the league by a mile. Like, the 2025 draft is insane for the number of second round picks that they've managed to gather. So it's really good, because I think, and you obviously know this better than anyone, they don't need to mortgage the farm to sort of make a push at the moment. They can make little adjustments, and if they happen to get there, fantastic. But what you're seeing instead is players playing in games that are meaningful, and showing that they know how to win. They know how to, like the Seattle game, for example, where not the greatest game on the planet, but you've got to win those ones. And as a fan of a team that currently is struggling to work out how to win games, that's a learned skill. And it's genuinely a learned skill in the NHL. So I think it's something that the Coyotes have shown this year is a bit of a step up. They're getting the ability to get over that line a bit more.
Exactly. And I think that's what's important about taking the turn out of the tanking years. You can make the argument that they didn't tank well enough the last two seasons. No. But you kind of have to take a step up from that. You look at even San Jose right now, and it's like misery. And you can't do that for more than 2 years, in my opinion. It's just not fair to the players. It's not fair to the fans. So even though the expectations, maybe they're not to make the playoffs, maybe at this point people are starting to glance that way, like you mentioned, whether they make it or not, just to learn how to win, to learn how to play meaningful games, to work together as a team, to come back and win, to hold on to leads. Those are all things that are going to be important in the years to come, where they actually really are trying to compete and they are trying to win, and they are, buyers at the deadline, which won't happen this year. It'll happen down the road, but you have to, winning it's a cultural thing. And, the Edmonton Oilers, like, they were so bad for so long, and they have all these superstars, but you can make the argument that maybe they just weren't in a culture where they learned to win. And I think that's what the Coyotes have right now. And especially with, some of the veteran leadership they brought in too, I think that balanced out with the youth is a good recipe for this team.
I think it's something that's gone under the radar a little bit, as you mentioned, some of the veteran leadership they brought in. I think there were some teams this year that decided to bring in some veteran players or experienced players that were going to, kick their team over the line. I'm looking at you, Toronto, and made the wrong calls across the board in terms of, who they were going for and why they were going for them. I think what the Coyotes did was very clever in terms of they went with some players that weren't necessarily they weren't going to be those sort of magnets for media attention, but just gradually bringing players along and sort of giving them the right leadership within the locker room and on ice. And, as a Sharks fan, I can say that's when the Sharks were good. That's one of the things that everyone went back to with the Sharks culture was Thornton, Marlowe, Burns, that locker room. You knew where the leadership was. You knew what the standard was, and you knew what was expected every night. And that's something I think that they added very well in the offseason when they looked at what they recruited.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not, like you mentioned, it's not just the big name guys. Like even a guy like Alex Kerfoot, like he's notoriously known as like a coach's favorite player just because he's so willing to play anywhere in the lineup and just to set that example for the younger guys. The other thing is you look at guys who a few years ago were the young guys, Clayton Keller, Lawson Krause, they're now like almost on their way to being veteran leadership, if not leaders on this team. So it's really cool to see the evolution because the thing that's knocking at the door is this huge youth movement. You have the 2 Russian players drafted this year. You have Maverick Lamoureux. Like there's a lot of Connor Geeky. There's a lot of youth that's on the heels of stepping into this team. So you need to establish like the leadership, the maturity, the right way to be. And I think you get that from guys like Kerfoot, like Zucker, like Matt Dumba. And even if they're just here on 1-year deals, just to instill that even in guys like Keller and Krause, so that when it's Geeky, Cooley, and everyone else, then guys like Keller and Krause and Schmaltz, they can, be those guys because of what they've learned from those other guys. I just think this is a really good locker room here. And I also think that Andre Tourigny has a big role to play in that as well.
Yeah, exactly. Again, smart recruitment, not looking for, necessarily big names, but looking for the right fit. Yeah. And that's a lot of teams get that very wrong when you watch rebuilds and you watch teams looking at how they're going to build. It is also really scary to think of the idea that Clayton Keller is moving into experienced player territory. It's really worrying for me to think, wow, that is true. He is in experienced player territory. Now, a bit of a leading question. Who is the most underrated young player in the league? And why is it Matias Maccelli?
Oh, my God. Don't even get me started. I went on my soapbox the other night on our show because I think he is so underappreciated. He's on a 9-game point streak right now. If he played in Canada, like, do you think we would be hearing the end of this? I don't think anybody knows. I think like NHL Stats put out a stat graphic the other night, and that was like the only recognition I saw online for Matias Maccelli outside of the Coyotes fan base. Yeah. I think it's a complete it's shocking to me still that he finished 4th in Calder voting behind Stuart Skinner.
Yeah,
how's he doing?
Yeah, that's the Canadian look. That's the Canadian media guys feel like that. The Oilers might be vaguely decent. Quick, give the Oilers something. So. Yeah.
So that was frustrating. But Matias Maccelli, I mean, he was a 4th-round pick for the Coyotes. He was picked 98th overall. He's not, this flashy, first-round pick. And he's just quietly one of the best young players, honestly, in the league. And I don't think he gets any recognition because of the market that he plays in. We try to recognize him as much as possible. His passing ability, we thought going in the offseason, we talked a lot about a lot of players go through sophomore slumps. A lot of players, teams kind of figure out what their thing is. For Maccelli, he's an unbelievable passer. Our team's now going to defend differently against him, and he really hasn't missed a beat. He's passed a ton. I think, most of his points have come from assists, but he still has a couple goals. He had one the other night. The joke is Andre Tourigny tells him he needs to pass to the net. So every time he scores, we say, oh, he passed to the net. But yeah, I mean, he just deserves so much more recognition, but if he's not going to get it, we'll give it to him because he's deserving of it.
I mean, for people who might not be aware, his season stats across the board last year, and there's a lot of people that won't even vaguely be aware. Like last year, 64 games played, 49 points. 12 games this year, 10 points. Like again, as you said, if he was playing in a Canadian market, you would be hearing non-stop, he's the greatest player of all time. Look at this. It's amazing. It's wonderful. It's brilliant. Again, he's in the middle of the desert. And I was like, who? Like, you would very rarely find anyone who would have him listed, which is an absolute travesty, because you're right. He should have found himself in the top 3. We talked a little bit about it in our postseason wrap last year. He was unlucky not to find himself within the top 3 of Calder vote. Like, the Skinner thing was very much, apart from Canadian media, it was recency bias as well.
Yeah.
Because Skinner wasn't there for most of the season. He wasn't doing much. It was only the very end of the season when Jack Campbell started to fall apart the first time. You've got to live in it with Jack Campbell. It's a constant thing. But when he started to fall apart the first time, that's when Stuart Skinner played decently, not lights out. But yeah, that's what put him over the line. Like myself, he should have found himself in that top 3 of voting quite easily.
Yeah, and no one's arguing that he should have won, because I think like Matty Beniers was a shoo-in, but like to me, he deserved to be a finalist. He did.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So we've talked a lot about, there's a lot of positives here. Are there any concerns that you're looking at and going, things you want them to be, apart from, obviously Cooley scoring, but anything that you're looking at and going, this is where you want to see them take the next step?
Yeah, the penalty kill is really struggling right now. They're taking penalties every team takes penalties, but when they're taking the penalties, they're allowing goals against. I'm pretty sure their penalty kill it's definitely the bottom 3rd of the league, if not the bottom 4th. That's kind of a cause for concern right now, just because you have to have a good penalty. You have to have good special teams to win. And on the flip side, the power play has been extremely productive, but you can't just have a good power play. You also have to have a good penalty kill. And that's been a bit of a struggle. There's also been a few defensive zone breakdowns. If you watch the Coyotes closely, you'll see there's quite a few 2-on-1s or 2-on-0s, and it feels like there's at least one every game and leaving the goalie out to dry. Yeah, that's just something that they're going to have to clean up, whether it's their defensive system or just with the talent that they have right now. I'm not sure. But those are kind of the 2 biggest areas for concern. Earlier on, it was 5-on-5 scoring. I feel like they've picked that up a little bit more. So for me, the biggest things are the penalty kill and just the defensive breakdowns.
Yeah, it's been, we're talking about, the fact that a lot of it's been the defensive breakdowns and, giving 2-on-1s. One of the things that has been quietly good is the goaltending you're getting from, Ingram and Vejmelka. It's like Ingram's a 919, Vejmelka's a 904. There are teams, trust me, that would kill for that goaltending. Edmonton, San Jose has better goaltending than Edmonton right now. I do want to point that out. Statistically, we are better than the Oilers.
That's unreal.
It's absolutely insane. And there will be some people who will watch this and go, you're spending a lot of time hitting the Oilers. And yes, I am. I have in our previews every year, I have a bit of a thing that I say all the time, which is that there are a couple of teams whose roster construction rolls like an egg. And the Oilers are a team for me whose roster construction rolls like an egg. It's really poorly built on one line has to be brilliant. And if that line's not brilliant, you're in big trouble. And a lot of media seems to just ignore that and go, no, but they're a favorite for the cup. And I'm like, you can't win when you've got one line.
Yeah.
You cannot win with one line, because eventually you'll figure the line out. And once you figure that line out, or you do what LA is very good at doing against them, which is stopping that one line and making them go off the ice and then scoring 3 goals. So, yeah. If you're wondering, people, why I'm beating up the Oilers a lot, it's because they're not very good and they've got 2 generational talents.
The Coyotes have a better record than them right now.
Exactly. How dare you, Edmonton? This is, again, but what we're seeing is the difference between haphazard roster construction using just a couple of superstars versus a bit of thought going into how you layer the roster and where you pick your spots. And there's a lot that's, a lot of people, obviously things like, the Mullett and experience in the arena stuff, there are a lot of people that dismiss the Coyotes immediately, and that history of being a cap dump area, which has a lot of people dismissing their roster construction. But I do encourage people to take a bit more of a look at what they're doing. And as you mentioned, the youth that's coming through. They've got a lot of really good talent coming through. And it's just one of those ones where you're looking for how long is the bounce back going to be? And they're on that phase of the bounce back now. And they might make the playoffs out of the back of the bounce back.
Because the circumstances of their division and conference are that, so that there's a chance, which is crazy to say.
The chance is that they very much could. Now, speaking of that, playoffs, is that something that is starting to be whispered in circles? Whispered.
We whisper it on our show. I mean, we talk about the Coyotes 5 days a week, so we have to bring it up. And it was so funny because we had a whole show, I think like 2 weeks ago, where the whole show was like, can this team realistically make the playoffs? And then the next day or 2 days later, they blew the 4-1 lead to the LA Kings and lost in regulation 5-4. And we were thinking, well, no, like they can't make the playoffs if they do stuff like that. But, every game, either they find a way to win or it's within one, or they take it to overtime or whatever it is. Listen, like if they made the playoffs right now and they're playing Vegas, like I would say Vegas in 4. Like I'm not sitting here saying the Coyotes are a contender, let alone even a playoff team, but just given the circumstances of their division and the conference that they're in, and if they continue to play well, and if they continue to play well at home, like we saw last year, they played extremely well at Mullett. There's a chance. It might not end well, but there's a chance. And I don't think anybody would ever do what was done a few years ago where, they had that crazy stretch in February and the Coyotes traded for Taylor Hall and kind of like gave up some first round picks and kind of stepped on the gas a little too soon. I don't think that Bill Armstrong and the Coyotes would go that direction right now. But I think the difference would be, instead of, the last 2 years, the Coyotes have been sell off at the deadline. Not that they would be buyers even if they were in a playoff position, but maybe they wouldn't sell off like they have in the past.
They probably there's not likely to be an auction. But the other thing is too, not a massive spate of being a buyer, but if the right opportunity popped up for something that was decent value, they would also be one of the teams at the deadline that could do that. And there's not a lot of teams that are sitting near a playoff spot that have the flexibility
with the draft capital that they have in their like Bill Armstrong can give up like 2 third-round picks and it would be like nothing.
Wouldn't feel it. There is such a thing, and it always sounds weird, but there is such a thing as too many draft picks. So you can use some of that later capital to sort of flip that over and get there. Now the other thing before we sort of start wrapping it up, Mullett this year, has it been exactly what it was last year?
I would say from the fan perspective, yes. I think it's still like every time I walk in there, I have to pinch myself and say, how am I watching an NHL game in this building? It's insane. I think the energy is still there. I think, obviously there's the nights that they play Chicago or they play a Canadian team where you're going to get probably half the crowd in that other team's uniform. You got that at Gila River too. So it's not anything new. It's just a smaller sample size. But I think the atmosphere is amazing. I think it's so cool. It's sold out every game. They do a great job with the in-arena, theatrics. And from a viewership perspective, it hasn't lost any of its luster. How the players feel about it, I don't know. Maybe some of the teams coming in have gotten over the shock factor, but I mean, it's still, I still think it's a home ice advantage for sure.
Oh, completely. And like as my little sort of caption under my name says on the podcast.
I know. I was laughing at that.
I really do wish that the SAP had like Mullett attendance numbers in terms of percentage. Like I had a look at the percentage of the numbers this year, and the Sharks are down at like 13, which is for that building ridiculous. And the other night when they won, it was hilarious because the crowd was going really mental, but there were only a very small number of people in there. You could have run around the arena and it would have been fine. You could have moved to any section you wanted. Yeah. Sharky is really obvious when there's no one in the arena because it's like it's him, and he just takes up most of the seats. And sort of my last sort of question and my last sort of hope is that next time we chat, I want to see if we can get an appearance from the Mullett Magician, because look. I'm assuming Gila River Arena has got him booked at the moment on a tour.
They got to fill the building with something.
The most recent trick from the Mullett Magician was quite something.
It was.
I do appreciate on the side. I do appreciate that there was no retake.
Nope.
It's like, no, we're riding this one home. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go and watch the last PNH Coyotes podcast, and you will not be disappointed by the magician. He is quite something else.
He really is. We are very lucky to have him, even though he is elusive and we don't actually know who he is.
Who knows where he is? He can't find him. I would like to see before the end of the year, Mullett decided like a one of the period gaps just to get the Mullett Magician out in the middle of the ice for like a magic show.
Oh my God, that's a great idea. I might have to try and make that happen.
That could be brilliant. Like, think about it, the smoke. I've got a very Arrested Development sort of view of it. You know, like there's like, you know, smoke, but he like throws his own smoke capsule down and like runs through the middle of it. And it's like this whole show, and people who don't watch are just going to be thoroughly confused, and that's going to be even better.
Yep, I agree. Oh my God.
No, I absolutely love that. And I absolutely love getting to watch. Again, even though I'm not a Coyotes fan, I watch a lot of your stuff because it's just really entertaining.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So especially, you know, you Steve and Craig, it's so much fun to watch. So just let everyone know, if they don't know, and most people do, where they can find you.
Yes, so you can find our show on the PHNX Sports YouTube channel, and you can follow our show specifically on Twitter at PHNX_Coyotes, and then you can follow me at Leah Merrall, and if you're watching, my @ is on the screen. So there you go.
So that has been absolutely fantastic to get to chat to you again. I always like to get to talk Coyotes with you. It's good to get that extra perspective into the group, and especially given that we have said a surge in Coyotes fans in Australia. So
great. Well, I'm happy to come back anytime, and we'll try and get Craig and Petey involved next time too.
Looking forward to that. So thank you very much, Leah, and we will catch everybody later.